Okay, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about importance of conflict and workplace innovation. Barrow and Company, our company is a Christian-based consulting firm that places a strong emphasis on professionalism, relational harmony, and mission alignment. These commitments have served the organization well. At the same time, they have contributed to a reluctance to engage directly with disagreement. Over time, fear of conflict has constrained growth and innovation, not because leaders lack ideas or competence, but because certain conversations feel disproportionately costly. This session is designed to examine how leaders can intentionally create conditions where innovation is supported rather than avoided. Now, when organizations struggle to innovate, the issue is rarely a lack of intelligence, talent, or motivation. Instead, and more often, the constraint is environmental. Research on creativity demonstrates that innovation depends less on individual brilliance and more on the conditions leaders create around thinking and interaction. When those conditions discourage risk, dissent, or uncertainty, innovation narrows quickly. One way to understand this dynamic is through the distinction between convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking prioritizes efficiency, agreement, and closure. It is essential for execution, but when it dominates too early, it eliminates the range of ideas considered. Divergent thinking, divergent thinking, on the other hand, expands the field of possibilities by encouraging multiple perspectives, competing interpretations, and unresolved questions. Guilford identified divergent thinking as a core mechanism underlying creativity, noting that innovation requires tolerance for ambiguity before solutions are selected. Now, leadership is very important here. Leadership determines which mode dominates, whether divergent or convergent thinking. Northouse defines leadership as a process oriented towards change, and change introduces uncertainty. Transformational leadership challenges assumptions. Authentic leadership requires honest expression, and servant leadership involves confronting conditions that limits others' growths. So there's multiple leadership models here that kind of they advocate for this divergent thinking. Each of these leader models assumes leaders are willing to tolerate the discomfort that accompanies divergent thinking. When leaders prioritize harmony or efficiency too early, they unintentionally signal that disagreement is risky, even when innovation is desired. At our company, Barrow and Company, fear of conflict has become a subtle but powerful bottleneck. Sinek argues that trust is not the absence of tension, but confidence that tension can be navigated without loss of belonging. So there's this fear we have that we don't want disagreement, and there seems to be this lack of confidence that we can navigate the disagreements, that that we don't have that we can't disagree and still belong, and that's something that we need to overcome, and that's why we're here today. Innovation becomes intentional not because leaders demand creativity, but because they design conditions where divergent thinking is possible. So we can create an environment where we can disagree in a healthy manner. All right. So right now, take a second to digest that. And before we move on, we're going to take a minute. Each of you, I want you to reflect silently on where you most often see convergent thinking dominate our work. You don't need to share yet. Just note it for yourself and take a minute to do so. And for the purposes of brevity, we're just going to move forward for those that are viewing this presentation. All right, so to ground this conversation, we begin with a shared experience drawn from history, the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. It did not emerge from agreement. Not everybody in the room agreed this is the way we're going to do the Declaration of Independence, right? Thomas Jefferson's original draft underwent extensive revision by the Committee of Five in the Continental Congress, with entire sections altered or removed due to political, regional, and moral disagreement. That disagreement was not treated as all that disagreement that was in the first Congress. that was not seen as disloyalty. It was not seen as treason. It was seen as a work that they need to clarify this very important document. And there was a lot of disagreement as it was drafted, for better or for worse. Historians note that the durability of the Declaration of Independence rests in part on the fact that its ideas were tested, contested, and refined rather than accepted without challenge. So it was able to endure because there was disagreement. All right, now we're going to stop again. And before connecting this example directly to our company, we're going to pause for a discussion. So focus on what stands out to you about how disagreement functioned in that process with the Declaration of Independence. This isn't about drawing conclusions or making applications yet. It is simply about noticing how disagreement was handled and what it produced. And we're going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to do that for this discussion. All right, and for the purposes of the presentation and brevity, we'll move on. All right, with that example in mind, consider the following question. What truth about our work here at Barrow and Company might require disagreement before it can become clear? Take 1 minute to think about this individually first. After that, we will open the floor for discussion. There is no expectation that we arrive at agreement or resolution. The goal is to surface perspectives, not to reconcile them. As we talk, I will listen rather than mediate. I may ask clarifying questions, but this is not a debate or a problem-solving exercise. Research suggests that innovation often emerges when competing perspectives are articulated and examined rather than resolved prematurely. We'll spend about 10 minutes on this discussion. And again, for purposes of brevity, we'll move on for those reviewing this presentation. Now, leadership theory reinforces what we are seeing. Transformational leadership challenges assumptions. Authentic leadership depends on honest self-expression, and servant leadership requires confronting conditions that limits others' growth. Sinek emphasizes that trust is not the absence of tension, but confidence that disagreement can occur, again, and we said this earlier, it can occur without loss of belonging. Disciplined disagreement, when purposeful, can strengthen both decisions and relationships. And we're covering this again because I kind of want to hammer home on this point. All right. Now we're going to do what's an exercise called a dissent draft. And we're gonna go ahead and pilot this. And it's going to be applied in 2 parallel ways. And we're split into 2 leadership teams, which we've already done. You already know what teams you're on. So leadership team 1, you're going to apply your dissent draft to a real strategic decision currently under consideration: the potential expansion of Barrow and Company operations into Spokane. Your team will develop a primary proposal presenting the strongest possible case for expanding into the Spokane market. Alongside your proposal, you're going to produce a dissent draft that captures alternative interpretations, unresolved concerns, and minority perspectives that surfaced during discussion but were not incorporated into the primary recommendation. All right, that's team 1. Now, team 2. Your team will be tasked with developing a novel expansion concept for Barrow and Company into another market of your choosing, whatever you come up with. Your team will explore multiple possibilities, challenge assumptions about where and how the firm should grow, and engage divergent thinking before converging on a proposal. You will present the strongest case you can make for your chosen concept, again accompanied by a dissent draft documenting ideas and concerns that were considered but not selected. So each team, you're going to make your proposal, and then you're going to have dissent drafts that are also covered. Now, clarifying questions. Before teams begin, we will take a few minutes for clarifying questions. This is not a discussion about whether your proposals are good or bad. This is simply to ensure shared understanding of the task and the intent of the dissent draft. Research suggests that innovation improves when alternative viewpoints are surfaced and held in view rather than suppressed in the interest of speed or harmony. And I kind of got a little example here, this little picture. You can see the lemming's about to plunge off the cliff, but there's one lemming. He has an idea. He sees a zip line. Hey, everybody! If we all take this zip line, we can avoid this cliff here. So that's kind of like a little illustrative example of the dissent and the power that dissent can have, even if it's only one person. All right, and now we'll take about 10 to 15 minutes to go ahead and let's say 15 minutes. Go ahead and work on your initial conversations and your meetings with your groups about your ideas. As far as the overall assignment, we'll meet again at another time to kind of flesh everything out. But for the purposes of today, I'll give you 15 minutes to get started on that. And for the purposes of brevity, for those reviewing the presentation, I'll go ahead and skip forward. As we close, reflect on how often fear of conflict shapes your leadership decisions. Consider what changes when disagreement is treated as a leadership responsibility rather than a relational threat. Innovation and mission-driven organizations depends on leaders who are willing to remain engaged through tension rather than avoiding it. So again, the overall push of this presentation is that disagreement is healthy, and that leaders need to encourage disagreement. It's part of leadership. It's part of leadership process under multiple leadership theories to get that disagreement in a healthy way, whether it's servant leadership, whether it's transformational leadership, authentic leadership. It's all part of it. And if we rush too quickly through the decision-making process without airing out disagreement or without looking at opposing viewpoints, then we're not really doing good analysis. We need to kind of discern as leaders. I mean, there is a point where you kind of want to draw the line, but it is healthy, and we need to have healthy disagreement because we can be more innovative if we do that. And for our presentation reviewers, here's my references. And this concludes the presentation. Thank you.